Hey guys, tonight we begin with one of the darkest chapters in American history. A system so brutal that even people who lived through it struggle to find words for what they experienced. We're descending into the coal mines of Alabama during the convict leasing era, where black men were arrested on fabricated charges, sold to mining companies, and worked to death in conditions that made slavery look humane by comparison. This wasn't ancient history. This was the late 1800s and early 1900s, decades after the Emancipation Proclamation supposedly ended slavery in America. The men who suffered in these mines were legally free, but the system found ways to chain them again, to extract their labor, to use them up and discard them like broken tools. It's a story that got buried along with its victims, but it deserves to be told. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's start with how you ended up in this situation, because understanding convict leasing requires understanding how the system created convicts out of free people. The Civil War ended slavery, but it didn't end the need for cheap labor, especially in the South, where the entire economy had been built on forced work. The plantation owners, the industrialists, the men who ran the mines and built the railroads, they needed bodies to do the work, and they weren't willing to pay fair wages to get them. So they found another way. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery, except as punishment for crime. That exception became a loophole large enough to swallow hundreds of thousands of black lives. The Black Codes came first, laws passed across the South immediately after the war that criminalized ordinary behavior when black people did it. Vagrancy laws made it a crime to be unemployed, which meant any black man without a white employer vouching for him could be arrested. The definition of vagrancy was flexible enough to catch almost anyone. Walking on railroad tracks, speaking too loudly, being out after dark, not having proof of employment, looking suspicious to a white person who felt like calling the sheriff. If you couldn't prove you had a job, you were a vagrant. If you left a job without permission, you were a vagrant. If you were between jobs, you were a vagrant. The law was designed to catch you no matter what you did. Other laws targeted behaviors that weren't crimes at all when white people did them. Gambling was illegal, but only enforced in black communities. Changing employers without permission became a criminal offense. Speaking disrespectfully to a white person could get you arrested. Being present at a place where a crime allegedly occurred made you an accomplice. The creativity was almost impressive, if it weren't so evil. They invented crimes specifically to arrest black people, and then they leased those prisoners to private companies who needed workers. The arrest was the first step in a process designed to turn free people into slaves by another name. The courts were part of the machinery, not a check on it. Judges were elected by white voters who wanted black labor controlled. Sheriffs earned fees for each arrest, which meant they had financial incentives to arrest as many people as possible. Lawyers cost money that most black defendants didn't have, so they faced trial without representation. Juries were all white because black people couldn't serve. The trials themselves were formalities, lasting minutes, the verdict predetermined, the sentence whatever the labor market demanded. If the mines needed workers, sentences got longer. If the railroads were behind schedule, more people got arrested. The justice system wasn't just compromised by racism. It was operated as a labor recruitment mechanism, kidnapping people under color of law. Now imagine you're one of the arrested. You are walking down a road in rural Alabama, maybe heading to visit family, maybe looking for work, maybe just existing as a black man in a place where existing was enough to make you suspicious. A deputy stops you, asks for your papers, asks where you're going, asks questions designed to trap you no matter how you answer. You don't have documentation because you've never needed it before, because freedom was supposed to mean not needing a pass to walk down a public road. But that's not how it works anymore. You're arrested for vagrancy, hauled before a judge the next morning, convicted in a proceeding that lasts less than 5 minutes, and sentenced to a term that might be months or might be years. The sentence isn't really about the alleged crime. It's about how much labor someone is willing to pay for. The leasing happens fast. The state doesn't want to house prisoners, doesn't want to feed them, doesn't want to spend any money on people it considers worthless. Private companies bid for the right to lease convicts, paying the state a fee per prisoner per day. The highest bidder wins, and you become their property for the duration of your sentence. The mining companies are the hungriest buyers, always needing more workers for the dangerous, deadly work of extracting coal from Alabama's hills. Tennessee Coal, Iron and Railroad Company, Pratt Coal and Coke Company, Sloss Sheffield Steel and Iron Company. These corporate names become synonymous with suffering. They pay the state, and the state delivers you to the mines. And what happens after that is nobody's concern except the company that now owns your labor. You're transported to the mining camp in chains, along with dozens of other men who've been swept up by the same system. Some of them are actual criminals, men who committed real offenses, but many are like you, arrested for nothing, convicted of existing. The camp appears through the trees, a collection of wooden buildings surrounded by fences, guards with rifles watching from towers. It looks like a prison, because it is a prison, a private prison operated for profit, where the only measure of success is how much coal comes out of the ground and how little it costs to extract. You're marched to the processing area, stripped of your clothes, given a uniform that's already stiff with the sweat and blood of previous wearers, assigned a number that will be your identity for as long as you survive. The mine itself is a hole in the earth, a shaft descending into darkness, into heat, into an underworld that will become your entire existence. The coal seams in Alabama run deep, and the companies have been chasing them for years, tunneling further and further from the surface, creating labyrinths that stretch for miles underground. The entrance is a rectangle of darkness set into the hillside, tracks running into it for the coal cars, a steady stream of men going in and coming out, though not always the same men. The smell hits you before you enter, a mixture of coal dust, sweat, mule dung, and something else, something you'll later recognize as fear. The men around you move with the shuffling gait of exhaustion, their faces black with coal dust, their eyes showing white, their bodies already broken by work that will eventually break you too. You descend into the mine for the first time, and the darkness swallows you. The shafts are lit by oil lamps that create pools of flickering light surrounded by absolute blackness. The walls press in, the ceiling sometimes so low you have to crawl, the air thick with dust that coats your lungs with every breath. The temperature rises as you go deeper, the earth's heat combining with the body heat of dozens of men working in confined spaces, until the sweat pours off you constantly, soaking. Clothes that never dry, creating conditions perfect for the skin diseases that will eventually cover your body. The noise is constant, picks striking rock, coal cars rattling on tracks, men shouting, mules braying, the earth itself groaning as tunnels are cut deeper into its body. Your job is to dig coal, to swing a pick for hours without stopping, to fill cars that will be hauled to the surface while you stay below, always below. The coal seam might be 3 feet thick, or it might be 6 inches, and when it's 6 inches, you work lying on your side, swinging the pick in an arc that barely clears your own body, the rock pressing down on you from above, the coal dust filling your mouth and nose with every breath. The work is done by lamplight, the small flame on your cap the only illumination, casting shadows that make the tunnel walls seem to move, that hide the dangers until they're on top of you. The quota is set by the company, and it's set high, higher than any reasonable person could meet consistently, but meeting it is mandatory. Each man is expected to mine a certain tonnage each day, and the cars are weighed when they reach the surface. Fall short and you're punished. Meet the quota and you're expected to exceed it tomorrow. The system is designed so that you're always behind, always in debt to the company, always one bad day away from the whip. Some men manage to meet quota by working every possible minute, by skipping meals, by pushing their bodies past every limit. Others form informal partnerships, helping each other fill cars, covering for men who are sick or injured, trying to protect the group from punishment that falls on individuals. The guards carry leather straps, wooden paddles, whatever implements of pain the camp boss prefers, and they use them liberally, not just for punishment, but for motivation, for entertainment, for the simple exercise of power over men who can't fight back. The whippings happen in front of everyone, the victim stripped and held down while the blows fall, the sound of leather on flesh echoing through the camp, the screams serving as warnings to everyone watching. A man might receive 20 lashes, 50 lashes, 100 lashes, the number depending on the offense and the mood of the guard administering the punishment. Some men die from whippings, their bodies unable to withstand the trauma, the skin flayed from their backs, the shock stopping their hearts. Their deaths are recorded as due to other causes or not recorded at all, the truth buried along with their bodies. The mines themselves are death traps in ways that go beyond the intentional cruelty. Coal mining is inherently dangerous, but the convict mines were worse than any free labor operation would have been allowed to be. Safety measures cost money, and the companies had no incentive to spend money protecting workers who could be replaced for the cost of another lease payment. Ventilation was inadequate, allowing methane gas to accumulate in the tunnels, creating conditions for explosions that could kill dozens at once. The Pratt Mines disaster of 1888 killed over 100 men when gas ignited deep underground, the explosion so powerful it blew bodies out of the mine entrance. So hot it fused coal and rock and flesh into indistinguishable masses. Roof supports were minimal, the timbers too few and too weak, the rock above groaning and cracking until it came down on the men below. The explosions were spectacular tragedies that occasionally made the newspapers, but the daily accidents killed more men over time. Cave-ins buried workers under tons of rock, sometimes killing them instantly, sometimes trapping them alive to suffocate slowly, while rescuers tried to dig through. Coal cars broke loose and rolled down inclines, crushing anyone in their path. Tools slipped and struck flesh. Men fell down shafts that descended hundreds of feet. The mules that hauled coal cars through the tunnels kicked and bit, injuring handlers who couldn't get out of the way in the cramped passages. Every day brought new injuries, new deaths, new reminders that the mine would take you eventually, that the only question was when and how. The hours are inhuman. You enter the mine before dawn and emerge after dark, spending your entire waking life underground, except for the brief periods of eating and sleeping. 14 hours, 16 hours, sometimes more during busy seasons when the company needs extra production. There are no days off, no weekends, no holidays. Sunday might bring a few extra hours of rest, or it might not, depending on the whims of the management and the demands of the market. Christmas and New Year's pass like any other days, marked only by the guard's mood, which might be slightly better or slightly worse than usual. You work until you can't work anymore, and then you're punished until you work again, and the cycle continues until your sentence ends or your body gives out. For many men, the body gives out first. The food is barely enough to sustain life, certainly not enough to sustain the brutal labor demanded. Cornmeal and fatback, day after day, the same meal morning and night, supplemented occasionally with beans or vegetables if the camp is well supplied. More often just the cornmeal mush and the rancid pork fat that provides the only calories the company is willing to spend. The portions are calculated to keep you alive and working, nothing more. Every calorie a cost that cuts into profits. A mining company that fed its convict laborers well was a mining company that made less money, and the whole point of the system was to make money. Men grow thin despite the physical labor that should have built muscle. Their bodies consume themselves, burning fat and then muscle to fuel work that demands more than the food provides. The hunger becomes a constant companion, a gnawing in your belly that never fully goes away, that wakes you at night, that makes you dream of food you'll never eat, that makes you think about food constantly, even when you should be thinking about the rock above your head that might come down at any moment. Some men steal from each other, desperate enough to risk the punishment that comes with getting caught. Some men catch rats and roaches, eating whatever they can find in the barracks, their bodies demanding fuel that the company won't provide. The guards don't care what you eat as long as you keep working. They don't care if you're starving as long as you can still swing a pick. The water situation is almost as bad as the food. The camps have wells or streams that provide drinking water, but the water is often contaminated, shared by men and mules alike, carrying diseases that spread through the population in waves. Dysentery is endemic. Men losing control of their bowels, losing fluid their bodies can't afford to lose, weakening to the point where work becomes impossible and death becomes likely. The latrines are pits dug behind the barracks, overwhelmed by the number of users, breeding grounds for the flies that spread illness, stinking so powerfully that the smell reaches everywhere, that you can never fully escape it, that it becomes part of the background of your existence like the coal dust and the fear. The sleeping quarters are wooden barracks, rows of bunks stacked 3 high. Men packed so tightly that turning over means bumping the person next to you, that the body heat of dozens becomes overwhelming on summer nights, that the cold of winter seeps through walls that were never built to keep anything out. The mattresses are straw ticks, thin and infested with vermin, the straw flattened by use until you might as well be lying on the wooden slats beneath. The blankets are inadequate, thin wool that might keep you comfortable in mild weather, but that can't fight the Alabama winter when it turns serious. In summer, the barracks become ovens, the heat trapped inside, the smell of unwashed bodies, overwhelming, the air so thick it's hard to breathe. In winter, men freeze, huddling together for warmth, waking to find frost on the inside of the walls, breathing out clouds that hang in the air. The lice and bed bugs are constant, crawling across your skin as you try to sleep, biting and itching and spreading diseases that will eventually kill some of your fellow prisoners. You can feel them moving on you, can hear them in the straw, can see them when you shake out your clothes in the morning. There's no way to get rid of them, no bathing facilities adequate to the task, no clean clothes to change into, no escape from the infestation that covers every surface and every body in the camp. The itching drives men half mad, scratching until they bleed, creating open sores that become infected, adding one more misery to the pile that already seems unbearable. Sleep is something you steal in fragments, never enough, never restful. Your body crying out for rest that the schedule won't allow. The guards are not bound by any law you would recognize. They can beat you for any reason or no reason. They can shoot you if you try to escape, and sometimes they shoot you even if you don't. They can withhold food, can extend sentences, can make your life significantly worse than it already is. And there's no one to appeal to, no oversight, no accountability. Some guards are simply cruel, men who enjoy inflicting pain, who sort out this work because it lets them hurt people without consequences. Others are indifferent, doing a job, viewing the prisoners as less than human, treating you the way they might treat a stubborn mule. Neither type sees you as a person. You're a unit of production, a machine that converts food into coal, valuable only as long as you keep producing. The death rate in the Alabama mines was staggering, so high that it shocked even people who were used to industrial accidents, even people who thought black lives were cheap. In some years, nearly half, the convict miners died. Not were injured, died. The Banner mine in Jefferson County recorded death rates that approached 45% in its worst years. The Pratt mines, which would later become part of the U.S. Steel Empire, killed convicts at rates that would have been scandalous if the victims had been anyone who mattered to the people in power. The causes of death were various, and the records, when they exist at all, often obscure the truth. Cave-ins that buried men alive, the rock coming down without warning, trapping workers under tons of debris that might take days to clear, by which time the trapped men had suffocated or bled to death or simply died of thirst, waiting for rescue that came too late. Explosions of coal gas that incinerated entire work crews, the methane accumulating in poorly ventilated tunnels until a spark from a pick or a lamp set off a fireball that traveled through the shafts at the speed of sound, burning everything in its path, leaving bodies charred beyond recognition. Falls down shafts, tumbles from unstable platforms, collisions with coal cars, injuries from the mules that dragged equipment through the tunnels, the 1,000 ways that a dangerous environment could kill men who were already weakened by hunger and exhaustion. The diseases killed even more than the accidents. Tuberculosis was endemic, the coal dust shredding lungs with every breath, creating lesions where the bacteria could take hold. The cramped sleeping quarters ensuring that the disease spread from man to man until nearly everyone was infected. The TB came on slowly, a cough that got worse, a weakness that didn't go away, a fever that spiked and fell and spiked again, until finally you were coughing blood and couldn't work and were left to die in the camp hospital or wherever you happened to collapse. Pneumonia killed men weakened by overwork and underfeeding, their bodies unable to fight infections that healthy men might survive. Dysentery swept through, camps where sanitation was non-existent, dehydrating men to the point of death. Typhoid came with contaminated water. Smallpox came in waves. Every disease that preys on weakened immune systems found its way into the convict camps. And then there were the deaths that weren't accidents at all. The men who were beaten to death by guards who went too far. The men shot while allegedly escaping. The men worked until their hearts gave out. The men who simply disappeared from the records without explanation. The companies had no obligation to account for their workers the way they would have had to account for free employees. A dead convict was a financial inconvenience, a lease payment that had been wasted, but it wasn't a crime. wasn't an investigation, wasn't anything that required explanation. The bodies were buried in unmarked graves near the camps, often in the same mass trenches, often without any notification to families who didn't know where their relatives had been taken in the first place. The company doctors, when they existed at all, were there to get men back to work, not to heal them. A man who couldn't work was useless, a cost without a return. So the goal was always to return prisoners to the mines as quickly as possible, regardless of their actual condition. The doctor's examination was brief and brutal. Can you walk? Can you hold a pick? Can you produce coal? If the answers were yes, you went back to work. If the answers were no, you might get a day or two in the hospital ward, a cot in a room full of other broken men, before you were sent back anyway or left to die. Injuries that should have meant weeks of rest were treated with a day or two off before the man was sent back underground. Broken bones were splintered crudely and declared healed long before they actually were. Infected wounds were bandaged and ignored until the infection spread, until gangrene set in, until amputation became the only option. Diseases were treated with whatever patent, medicines the company had bought cheap, nostrums that did nothing, that might actually make things worse, that were given out to create the appearance of medical care without the expense of actual treatment. Men worked with broken bones, with infected wounds, with fevers that should have kept them in bed, with conditions that were slowly killing them, because the alternative was punishment that might kill them faster. Some doctors were simply incompetent, men who couldn't find work in legitimate medical practice, who took jobs in the convict camps because no one else would have them. Others were competent but constrained, understanding what their patients needed but unable to provide it, knowing that the company wouldn't pay for real treatment, that advocating too strongly for prisoners' health would get them fired. A few were actively cruel, seeing the prisoners as less than human, experimenting with treatments, withholding care as punishment, participating in the system's cruelty rather than just tolerating it. The doctor's job was to determine whether you could still swing a pick, and if you could, you went back to the mine. If you couldn't, you might be sent back anyway. Your life was worth less than the coal you could produce. The psychological toll was as devastating as the physical suffering. You had been a free man, with a name, a family, a life. Now you were a number, a commodity, a tool to be used until you broke. The humiliation was constant, the guards addressing you with slurs, the work stripping away every dignity, the conditions reducing you to an animal struggling to survive. Men lost hope, which was perhaps the most dangerous thing to lose, because hope was what kept you putting one foot in front of the other. Some men tried to escape, knowing the odds were against them, preferring the risk of being shot to the certainty of being worked to death. Most were caught and brought back, punished savagely, their sentences extended. A few made it, disappearing into the woods, making their way north, carrying stories that the rest of the country didn't want to hear. Some men chose death deliberately, a final act of agency in a world that had stripped them of all other choices. They walked into danger in the mines, or they attacked guards knowing they would be killed, or they simply stopped eating and let their bodies fade. The will to live can only sustain so much, and the camps tested that limit daily. The men who survived did so through luck as much as determination, through random chance that put them in the safer parts of the mine, that kept them out of the worst guard's sight, that spared them from the epidemics that killed their bunkmates. Survival wasn't something you earned through effort. It was something that happened to you, or didn't. The companies that ran these operations were not shadowy figures. They were pillars of Southern industry. Their executives respected members of society, their stockholders including some of the most prominent names in American business. Tennessee Coal, Iron and Railroad Company was eventually bought by U.S. Steel, making one of the largest corporations in America complicit in the system. The profits generated by convict labor funded the industrialization of the South, built fortunes that still exist today, created the infrastructure that modern Alabama still uses. The coal that came out of those mines powered factories and heated homes across the country. The steel made from Alabama iron built bridges and buildings. The entire southern industrial economy was subsidized by this system of neo-slavery. The costs externalized onto black bodies that nobody was counting. The leasing companies preferred black convicts, and the statistics show it clearly. While black people were a minority of Alabama's population, they were the vast majority of its convict laborers. The system wasn't colorblind. It was designed to catch black people specifically, to recreate the labor, arrangements of slavery under a new legal framework. White convicts existed, but they were often given different, less dangerous work, or they served shorter sentences, or they were leased to farms rather than mines. The mines were for black men, because black lives were cheaper, because black deaths didn't generate the kind of attention that white deaths might, because the whole system depended on a supply of laborers who could be used up and replaced without consequence. The families of convict laborers suffered terribly, often not knowing where their husbands or sons or brothers had been taken, often not learning of their deaths until months later, if at all. A man could be arrested in one county, tried in another, and shipped to a mine in a third, all without anyone notifying his family. The arrest itself might happen without witnesses, a man taken while walking alone, his family learning only when he failed to come home, searching for days or weeks before discovering that he was in custody, if they ever discovered it at all. Women showed up at jails looking for missing relatives, only to be told they had been leased out, with no information about where or for how long. The clerks who processed the paperwork didn't keep track of such details, or didn't care to share them, or actively enjoyed the suffering of families desperate for information. A wife might travel to 3 different counties looking for her husband, spending money she couldn't afford, only to learn that he had been sent to a mine she'd never heard of in a part of the state she'd never been to. By the time she found him, if she found him, he might already be dead. Children grew up without fathers, their families plunged into poverty by the loss of a breadwinner who had committed no real crime. The women left behind had to find ways to support themselves and their children in an economy that offered black women few options beyond domestic service, work that paid barely enough to survive, that required long hours away from home, that left children to raise themselves or be raised by neighbors and relatives. The economic devastation rippled outward from each arrest, affecting not just the man who was taken, but everyone who depended on him. The terror of the arrest extended beyond the man who was taken, spreading through communities, creating a constant fear that any black man might be next. Parents warned their sons to be careful, to avoid situations that might attract the attention of sheriffs looking for laborers, to never be caught alone, to never give anyone an excuse. But the excuses were so flimsy that avoiding them was impossible. You could be arrested for walking on a road. You could be arrested for sitting on a bench. You could be arrested for existing in a place where a white person wanted you removed. The fear was rational because the threat was real, and the fear itself was part of the system's function, keeping black communities afraid, keeping black workers compliant, making sure everyone understood who had power and who didn't. The reformers who tried to end convict leasing faced powerful opposition from every direction. The state government depended on the revenue the system generated, money that funded schools and roads and public services without requiring white taxpayers to pay higher taxes. Governors, who might have been sympathetic to reform, found themselves trapped by budgets that couldn't balance without the lease payments. Legislators who proposed changes found their bills killed in committee, their political careers threatened, their motives questioned. The system had become essential to the state's finances, and dismantling it would require finding new revenue sources that no one wanted to provide. The mining companies had political connections that protected their interests at every level of government. They contributed to campaigns, employed relatives of politicians, made themselves indispensable to the state's economic development. Their executives sat on boards with governors and senators, socialized with judges and prosecutors, belonged to the same churches and clubs as the men who made the laws. When journalists wrote exposés of the conditions in the camps, company representatives responded with denials and counterattacks, questioning the journalists' motives, dismissing the reports as exaggerations or northern propaganda designed to damage the South. When prisoners died in numbers that should have scandalized the nation, the deaths were explained away as the natural consequences of working with dangerous criminals, as if the men in the mines were hardened murderers rather than vagrants and petty offenders. The companies produced statistics showing that death rates in their operations were comparable to death rates in free mining operations. Statistics that were false, that required creative accounting, that compared convict mines to the most dangerous free operations rather than to industry averages. The lies were told confidently and repeatedly, and enough people believed them or pretended to believe them that reform remained impossible for decades. Some prisoners testified when they got the chance, their words preserved in investigations that led to nothing, in court proceedings that changed nothing, in newspaper articles that were read and forgotten. They described the whippings in detail, the number of lashes, the implements used, the guards who administered them with obvious pleasure, the injuries that festered and became infected, the men who died from punishment that was supposed to correct behavior. They described men dying in the mines, crushed by rock, burned by explosions, worked until they collapsed, their bodies left where they fell until the shift ended. They described the hunger and the cold and the heat and the disease, the constant presence of death, the absence of hope, the feeling of being worked to death by a system that valued coal more than human life. Their words were recorded, filed away, used to generate brief moments of outrage that never translated into meaningful reform, and then forgotten until historians rediscovered them decades later. The system finally ended not because of moral awakening, but because of economic calculation. As the 20th century progressed, the convict leasing system became less profitable and more troublesome. Free laborers, including immigrants and poor whites willing to work for low wages, became available in larger numbers. The bad publicity surrounding convict deaths created occasional problems for the companies. Most importantly, the state realized it could extract even more value by using convict labor directly on public works projects rather than leasing it to private companies. Alabama formally ended convict leasing in 1928, one of the last states to do so, but it replaced the system with chain gangs and prison farms that continued many of the same abuses under different names. The men who survived the mines carried their experiences with them for the rest of their lives. The physical damage was obvious. Lungs destroyed by coal dust, bodies broken by labor, injuries that never healed properly. The psychological scars were less visible, but equally permanent. Nightmares that never stopped, an inability to trust, a flinching response to authority, that made normal life difficult. Some men couldn't talk about what they'd experienced. Others couldn't stop talking about it, needing to witness, needing someone to know. Most died before anyone thought to record their stories in any systematic way, their experiences buried with them, the full truth of the convict leasing system, known only to those who lived it. The mines themselves are mostly abandoned now, shafts collapsed or sealed, the coal exhausted, or no longer profitable to extract. The camps where men suffered and died have rotted back into the earth, leaving few traces, no monuments, no acknowledgement of what happened there. The companies that profited have been renamed, merged, dissolved, their connection to convict leasing buried in corporate histories that prefer not to remember. The descendants of the men who died in those mines often don't know the full story of how their ancestors suffered, the records incomplete, the history deliberately obscured. But the system's effects echo forward through time in ways that are still being understood. The wealth extracted from convict labor-funded developments that shaped modern Alabama and the modern South. The patterns of incarceration established during the convict leasing era, the criminalization of black existence, the use of the justice system as a labor recruitment mechanism. These patterns didn't disappear when the leasing ended. They evolved, adapted, found new expressions in mass incarceration, in prison labor programs, in the ongoing overrepresentation of black Americans in the criminal justice system. The convict leasing system was not an aberration. It was a template. Tonight, as you settle into sleep, think about the men who descended into those mines, who swung picks in the darkness, who breathed coal dust until their lungs gave out. Think about Green Cottenham, whose story was documented in Douglas Blackman's book Slavery by Another Name. Arrested for vagrancy in 1908, sold to a mining company, worked in conditions that killed so many others. Think about the thousands whose names we don't know, whose deaths weren't recorded, whose suffering generated the wealth that built industries and fortunes. Think about what it means that this happened in America, after emancipation, in a country that claimed to believe in freedom. But think also about the fact that some survived. Against odds that should have been insurmountable, some men made it through their sentences, walked out of the camps, returned to lives that would never be the same, but that were still lives. They carried witness even when no one wanted to hear. They told their children and grandchildren, kept the memory alive, refused to let the system erase itself completely. The convict leasing system tried to consume them entirely, to turn them into fuel for industry, to extract every bit of value and discard the rest. It failed. Not in the sense that it didn't cause immense suffering, because it did, but in the sense that it couldn't destroy the humanity of the men it tried to destroy. That persistence, that survival, that refusal to be completely erased is what we remember tonight. Let it carry you into peaceful sleep. Congratulations. You're free. You have the papers to prove it, folded carefully in your pocket, worn soft at the creases from being unfolded and refolded 1,000 times. Maybe your grandmother was freed by an enslaver who had a crisis of conscience on his deathbed. Maybe your mother saved for 20 years, hiring herself out on Sundays, scraping together enough coin to purchase her own flesh from the man who claimed to own it. Maybe you were born to parents who were already free, which makes you one of the lucky ones, though lucky is doing a lot of heavy lifting in that sentence. Either way, you're not enslaved. You can't be sold. You can't be whipped at another man's pleasure. You can't be separated from your family on a Tuesday because someone needed cash. The good news ends there. Because being free and being safe are two entirely different things. And in the antebellum South, free black people learned that distinction the hard way, every single day, from the moment they woke up until the moment they managed to fall into an uneasy sleep. Let's start with the papers, because those papers are your life. Without them, you're presumed to be an escaped slave. With them, you're merely a suspicious anomaly that makes white people uncomfortable. Your freedom papers need to be registered with the local court, which means white officials know exactly who you are, where you live, and that you exist in a category they find philosophically troubling. Every time you travel, even to the next county, you need to carry those papers. Every time a white person demands to see them, you need to produce them immediately, with a smile, with deference, with gratitude for being allowed to prove you're not property. If your papers get lost, stolen, damaged, or destroyed, you have a serious problem. Replacing them requires going back to court, finding witnesses who can testify to your status, paying fees you probably can't afford, and hoping the judge is in a generous mood, rather than the mood that says maybe this one should be sold for the county's benefit. Some free black people carried multiple copies. Some memorized the exact wording so they could recite it if needed. Some sewed papers into the linings of their clothes. The paranoia was justified. Without documentation, freedom evaporated like morning fog. Here's where it gets really precarious. The entire Southern economy depended on slavery, and free black people represented a living contradiction to the ideology that made slavery possible. If black people could be free, could work, could own property, could raise families, could exist as human beings rather than livestock, then maybe the whole system was built on a lie. That possibility made white Southerners deeply uncomfortable. And when white Southerners got uncomfortable, black people suffered. The slavocracy needed everyone to believe that black people were inherently inferior, naturally suited for bondage, incapable of self-governance. Every free black person who worked hard, raised a family, stayed out of trouble, and lived a respectable life was a walking refutation of that ideology. And ideologies under threat tend to produce desperate measures. So the laws governing free black lives were designed to make freedom as miserable as possible without technically being slavery. You couldn't vote, obviously. The ballot box was for white men only, and your opinions on governance were not requested. You couldn't testify against white people in court, which meant any white person could rob you, assault you, or destroy your property with near impunity. If a white man walked into your shop, took what he wanted, and walked out without paying, your only recourse was to find another white person willing to testify on your behalf, which was roughly as likely as finding gold in your breakfast porridge. You couldn't own firearms in most places, leaving you defenseless against the very people most likely to harm you. You couldn't gather in groups without white supervision, because apparently free black people sitting around talking was a threat to civilization itself. 3 black men discussing the weather might be plotting rebellion, as far as white authorities were concerned. You couldn't learn to read in some states, and you definitely couldn't teach other black people to read, because literacy was power, and power was dangerous in the wrong hands. You couldn't preach without a license, and licenses were hard to get and easy to revoke, because the authorities worried about what you might say and who might listen. You couldn't own certain types of property in certain places. You couldn't enter certain professions. You couldn't travel freely. You couldn't marry who you wanted, at least not legally, not in ways the state would recognize. You were free, technically, but freedom came with an asterisk the size of a plantation, and the fine print went on for pages. Now imagine trying to make a living under these conditions. You wake up in whatever cramped room or small house you've managed to secure, and you need to work because nobody's providing for you. Unlike enslaved people who were fed and housed by their enslavers, however inadequately, you were on your own. Your meals depended on your earnings. Your shelter depended on your rent. Every expense came out of your own pocket, and your pocket had holes in it that the law kept cutting wider. But the jobs available to free black people were limited by law and custom to the lowest rungs of the economy. You could be a laborer, hauling and lifting until your back gave out, competing with enslaved workers who could be hired out for less than you needed to survive. You could be a domestic servant, cleaning white people's houses and raising white people's children, invisible in their homes while being indispensable to their comfort. You could work on the docks, loading and unloading ships in the blistering heat, surrounded by enslaved workers doing the same jobs, the line between free and enslaved blurring in the sweat and exhaustion. You could be a craftsman if you'd somehow acquired a skill, a blacksmith or carpenter or barber or shoemaker. But even then, you faced restrictions that white craftsmen didn't face. Some cities required you to have a white guardian or sponsor who would vouch for your behavior and your business practices. Some states prohibited you from certain trades entirely, protecting white workers from the competition of black workers who might be willing to charge less or work harder. In some places, you couldn't hire white workers even if your business grew large enough to need help, because the sight of a white person working for a black person violated the natural order of things. If you were good at what you did, if you prospered even modestly, you attracted attention and resentment. A free black person with a nice coat or a well-built house was an offense against the entire ideology of white supremacy, a living argument that black people could thrive if given half a chance. And making that argument too loudly could get you killed. Let's talk about the guardian system, because this was one of the more insidious mechanisms of control. In many southern states, free black people were required to have a white guardian, essentially a sponsor who took legal responsibility for their behavior. This guardian could be a former enslaver, a sympathetic white friend, or simply someone willing to take on the role for a fee. Without a guardian, you might not be able to conduct business, sign contracts, or even remain in the state. The guardian had power over you that looked uncomfortably like ownership. They could restrict your movements, control your finances, and in some cases hire you out to other white people and keep the wages. If your guardian died, moved away, or simply decided they didn't want the responsibility anymore, you were suddenly unmoored, scrambling to find someone else willing to take on a role that most white people found distasteful or simply not worth the trouble. The system transformed freedom into a kind of supervised parole, with white people serving as perpetual probation officers for the crime of the existing while black. And then there were the taxes. Free black people in the antebellum South paid special taxes that white people didn't pay, essentially fines for the audacity of not being enslaved. Some states charged an annual head tax on every free black resident. Some required free black people to pay for their own registration, their own court appearances, their own documentation of a status that should have been self-evident. The money went into state coffers, or sometimes into the pockets of the officials collecting it, and the effect was to make free black life economically precarious even when work was available. You earned less than white workers, paid more in taxes and fees, faced restrictions on accumulating property, and lived one bad month away from disaster. Some free black people who fell behind on taxes or fees found themselves sold into slavery to cover the debt. Freedom, it turned out, had a price that came due annually, and if you couldn't pay, the state would find a way to reclaim what it had reluctantly granted. Here's something that kept free black people awake at night: kidnapping. The domestic slave trade was booming in the antebellum period, with enslaved people from the Upper South being sold to the cotton and sugar plantations of the Deep South at enormous profit. A healthy young black man could fetch over $1,000 at auction, a sum that represented years of wages for most white workers. A skilled craftsman might bring even more. Women of childbearing age were valuable for their labor and their potential to produce more enslaved workers. Children were investments in future labor. This created a powerful incentive for unscrupulous men to grab free black people off the streets, destroy their papers, and sell them into slavery hundreds of miles from anyone who might recognize them. Professional kidnappers operated throughout the South and even ventured into northern states to snatch victims. They worked alone or in gangs, sometimes with the cooperation of corrupt officials who would certify stolen people as legitimate property. They had networks of contacts, safe houses where victims could be held, forged documents that created paper trails of ownership. Some posed as legitimate slave traders. Others operated as outright criminals, grabbing people in the night and transporting them before anyone knew they were missing. The techniques were sophisticated because the profits were substantial, and the risks were minimal, given that a kidnapped person couldn't testify against their kidnappers. Once you were sold and transported, proving your free status became nearly impossible. You couldn't testify in court against white people. You had no papers because they'd been destroyed or confiscated. You were in a strange place where no one knew you, where no one had any reason to believe you over the white man who claimed to own you. Your word meant nothing against the bill of sale that some white man had fabricated. Even if you managed to get word to family or friends back home, what could they do? Travel hundreds of miles to testify in a court that didn't want to hear from them? Hire lawyers with money they didn't have? The system was designed to make recovery impossible. The stories of free black people who spent decades in slavery after being kidnapped, who sometimes never escaped at all, who died in bondage protesting to the end that they were free. These stories were common knowledge in free black communities. Parents warned children never to go anywhere alone. People traveled in groups when possible, hoping that numbers would discourage kidnappers looking for easy targets. Some simply never left their immediate neighborhoods, accepting a constrained life as the price of a safer one. The fear was constant, justified, and impossible to ever completely escape. Every stranger was potentially dangerous. Every journey was a risk calculation. The legal system offered little protection and considerable danger. Remember, you couldn't testify against white people. This single restriction undermined any possibility of justice. So if a white man beat you, robbed you, or burned down your house, you couldn't take the stand to describe what happened. You couldn't point at your attacker and say, "This is the man who did it." You couldn't present your side of the story to judge or jury. You needed a white witness willing to testify on your behalf, and white witnesses willing to testify against other white people on behalf of a black person were rare creatures, indeed. Those who did often faced social consequences, being labeled as race traitors or troublemakers, finding their own standing in the community damaged by association with your cause. The courts were staffed by white judges elected by white voters, interpreting laws written by white legislators, applying standards that assumed black inferiority as a given. White juries decided cases involving black defendants, and those juries generally believed that black people were inferior, that slavery was right and natural, and that free black people were a nuisance at best and a menace at worst. Getting justice in this system was like trying to win a game where the other side made all the rules and could change them whenever convenient. The dice were loaded, the deck was stacked, and the house always won. And if you were accused of a crime, heaven help you. Black defendants faced harsher sentences than white defendants for identical offenses. The presumption of innocence that supposedly governed American courts evaporated when the defendant was black. Juries were quick to convict and judges were quick to sentence. For minor offenses that would earn white people fines or short jail terms, black defendants might face years of labor, public whipping, or worse. Some free black people convicted of crimes were sold into slavery as punishment, their freedom forfeit over offenses that barely qualified as misdemeanors when committed by white people. The threat of the courtroom was another tool of control, another reminder that your freedom existed at the sufferance of a system designed to deny it. Let's talk about the constant threat of expulsion, because your right to remain in the state where you'd built your entire life was never secure. Throughout the antebellum period, Southern states passed increasingly restrictive laws aimed at reducing the free black population. Some states required newly freed black people to leave within a certain period or face re-enslavement. Some prohibited free black people from other states from entering, trapping existing residents while preventing others from joining them. Some states periodically debated whether to expel all free black people entirely, sending them to Liberia or some other distant place, eliminating the troublesome reminder that black and free could exist in the same body. Even when these expulsion proposals failed to become law, the debates themselves sent a message. You were tolerated, not accepted. Your presence was a problem that white people were constantly trying to solve. The ground beneath your feet was never stable. The community you'd built, the business you'd established, the family you'd raised could be swept away by a single legislative session if the political winds shifted. Free black people lived with this uncertainty constantly, knowing that their status depended not on rights, but on the fluctuating tolerance of people who saw them as a mistake. Movement was particularly fraught. If you needed to travel, to visit family in another county, to deliver goods to a customer, to attend a funeral or a wedding, to seek work in a nearby town, you faced a gauntlet of checkpoints, both official and informal. You needed your papers, obviously, but papers were not always enough. You also needed to avoid attracting the attention of the slave patrols that roamed the roads looking for runaways. These patrols, called patty rollers in the vernacular of the time, had the authority to stop any black person, free or enslaved, and demand proof of status. The patrols were often poor white men, resentful of their own position at the bottom of white society, taking out their frustrations on people they considered beneath them. They had legal authority and no oversight. They could stop you, question you, search your belongings, examine your papers with illiterate scrutiny, and decide whether you looked like someone who should be out on the road. Being stopped by a patrol meant being questioned about where you came from and where you were going, why you were traveling, and who could vouch for you. It meant being searched for weapons, for stolen goods, for messages that might be passing between enslaved people. It meant sometimes being beaten even when your papers were in order, because the papers said you were free, but the patrol said you had a suspicious attitude. And who was the court going to believe? Your word against theirs wasn't even admissible as evidence. Some free black people simply stopped traveling, limiting their lives to a small radius where they were known, where local whites could vouch for them, where the danger of a random encounter with strangers was minimized. This meant turning down opportunities, missing family events, letting the world shrink to a size that felt manageable rather than the size it should have been. Others traveled only in groups, hoping numbers would provide some protection, hoping that witnesses might discourage the worst abuses. They traveled during daylight when possible, along known routes, carrying documentation of their destinations as well as their origins. Everyone knew someone who had been detained, beaten, jailed, or worse simply for being in the wrong place while black. The roads were not free, no matter what your papers said. The social isolation was grinding. You existed in a middle space that belonged to no one, neither fully free nor enslaved, neither accepted by whites nor entirely trusted by the enslaved. Enslaved people might view you with suspicion, wondering if you thought yourself better than them, wondering if you would use your relative freedom to help them or to distance yourself from their condition, wondering whose side you were really on when push came to shove. Some enslaved people resented free black people for enjoying privileges they were denied. Others admired and envied them. The relationships were complicated by the chasm of legal status that separated people who might otherwise have been natural allies. White people viewed you as a contradiction and a threat, a living refutation of everything they believed about race and destiny. Your very existence argued against the ideology that justified slavery, and that made you dangerous regardless of how carefully you conducted yourself. You couldn't socialize with white people as equals, obviously. The color line was absolute in social situations, policed by custom and violence. But your interactions with enslaved people were also constrained by law and circumstance. Marrying an enslaved person meant your children would be born into slavery, following the condition of the mother. That knowledge haunted every romantic relationship that crossed the line between free and enslaved. Love was insufficient protection against a legal system that didn't recognize black love as worthy of protection. Befriending enslaved people too publicly attracted scrutiny, since white people worried that free black people would spread dangerous ideas about freedom, would help enslaved people escape, would foment the rebellions that slaveholders feared constantly. You had to be careful about who you talked to, how long you talked, what you were seen doing. Even innocent interactions could be interpreted as conspiracy. Some free black people owned enslaved people themselves, a fact that complicates any simple narrative about this period. Sometimes this ownership was a legal fiction to protect family members they couldn't otherwise free, a spouse or child purchased, but not manumitted because the law made manumission difficult or impossible. Sometimes it was genuine investment in the system that oppressed them. Free black people buying enslaved workers to run their businesses, participating in an economy built on bondage, because that was the only economy available. The moral compromises required to survive were constant and corrosive. You did what you had to do, and you tried not to think too hard about what that did to your soul. But the thinking came anyway, in quiet moments, in sleepless nights, in the face of your reflection. Now let's talk about family, because maintaining a family as a free black person in the antebellum South was an exercise in constant anxiety that would drive modern people to madness. If your spouse was enslaved, they could be sold at any moment, sent hundreds of miles away, and there was nothing you could do about it legally. You could beg. You could try to scrape together money to purchase them. You could appeal to the enslaver's sense of decency, if any existed. But in the end, they were property, and property could be disposed of as the owner saw fit. You might wake up one morning to find that your husband or wife had been sold overnight, that they were already on a wagon heading south, that you would never see them again as long as you lived. If your children were born to an enslaved mother, they were born enslaved regardless of your status, following the legal principle that children inherited the condition of the mother. You might have to watch your own children grow up in bondage, might have to see them working in fields or houses, might have to witness them being disciplined by enslavers who had no stake in their well-being. You might have to purchase your own children if you ever wanted them free, going to their legal owner with hat in hand, negotiating a price for flesh that you had helped create. You might have to see them sold away before you could accumulate enough money, shipped off to distant plantations while you stood helpless, their cries fading down the road. Some free black men worked for decades to purchase their wives and children, saving every penny, taking extra jobs, denying themselves comforts, only to see the prices rise faster than their savings. The enslaver might change their mind, might decide they wanted more money, might simply refuse to sell because they enjoyed the power of refusal. Some men finally succeeded, after years of effort, and then faced the realization that they now technically own their own family members, a legal relationship that twisted something sacred into something obscene. Manumitting purchased family members was itself complicated, sometimes requiring court approval, sometimes forbidden by law, sometimes triggering requirements that the freed person leave the state. The bureaucracy of bondage wrapped itself around families like chains, constraining even when it couldn't directly enslave. The emotional toll was immense. Every pregnancy was shadowed by fear about the child's status. Every birth was complicated by calculations of freedom and bondage. Every family gathering reminded you of who wasn't there, who might not be there next time, whose presence depended on the whims of white people who saw them as property. The anxiety never fully lifted. You couldn't plan for the future because the future was contingent on forces beyond your control. You loved knowing that love might not be enough to keep your family together. That knowledge sat in your chest like a stone, cold and heavy and impossible to forget. The church was supposed to be a refuge, and in some ways it was. Free black people in the antebellum South built their own congregations when they could, finding in religion a space where they could gather, sing, pray, and support each other. The church was one of the few institutions they could control, one of the few places where black leadership was possible, one of the few spaces where the constant performance of deference could be set aside, if only for a few hours. In church, a black man could be a deacon, a leader, a voice of authority. A black woman could sing without apology, could feel the Spirit move through her without worrying about white disapproval. The sanctuary was a space apart, and that apartness was precious. But even churches were regulated by the suspicious white gaze. Many states required that a white minister be present at all black religious gatherings, presumably to ensure that nothing seditious was being preached, that no plans for rebellion were being hatched beneath the cover of hymns. This white observer sat in judgment, listening for anything that might suggest resistance, anything that might need to be reported to the authorities. The presence poisoned the sanctuary, made even prayer feel supervised, turned worship into performance. Some states prohibited black churches entirely after Nat Turner's rebellion in 1831, blaming religious gatherings for fomenting resistance, seeing in every prayer meeting a potential conspiracy. Turner had been a preacher, and his rebellion had terrified white Southerners into crackdowns that lasted for decades. Where independent black churches existed, they were watched, harassed, sometimes burned. Ministers were questioned about their sermons. Congregations were dispersed by patrols. The message was clear. Even your relationship with God had to be supervised by white people. Even your prayers were suspect. Even your hope for salvation needed to be approved by those who saw themselves as your earthly masters. Some free black people attended white churches, sitting in segregated sections, listening to sermons that told them slavery was divine will, that obedience was their highest calling, that their proper place was somewhere below the white people who claimed to be saving their souls. The spiritual nourishment such churches offered was thin indeed, mixed with poison, telling you that your condition was God's will, while your soul screamed that God wanted something better for all his children. Education was another battleground. Learning to read and write was dangerous, forbidden in some states, restricted in others, always viewed with suspicion by white authorities who understood that literacy was power. A literate black person could read abolitionist newspapers smuggled down from the north. They could write passes for escaping enslaved people, forging the documents that might mean the difference between freedom and capture. They could communicate ideas that threatened the entire system, could correspond with allies, could record the injustices they witnessed for posterity. So states made it illegal to teach black people to read, free, or enslaved, punishing teachers and students alike. Schools for free black children were closed by law or by mob. Their teachers, sometimes white abolitionists, and sometimes free black people themselves, were arrested, fined, driven out of town, occasionally beaten. Students were dispersed, their books confiscated, their dreams of education criminalized. The message was clear. Ignorance was the natural condition for black people, and any attempt to change that condition was a crime against the social order. Some free black people learned anyway, in secret sessions conducted in back rooms and woods, with books hidden beneath floorboards, with lessons whispered so quietly that neighbors wouldn't hear. Parents taught children late at night, by candlelight, risking everything for the knowledge that might someday set them free in ways that legal freedom couldn't achieve. The hunger for knowledge was strong enough to risk punishment, because education represented something beyond practical skill. It represented the assertion that black minds were as capable as white minds, that the ideology of inferiority was a lie, that freedom might someday mean more than just not being owned. Every letter learned was an act of rebellion. Every word read was a victory against a system designed to keep black people in darkness. Let's talk about what happened when things went wrong, because things went wrong constantly. A fire destroys your workshop, and you have no insurance, no savings, and no white guardian willing to extend credit. A recession hits, and the customers who tolerated you in good times find white craftsmen during hard times. A new law passes, and suddenly your occupation is restricted. Your residence is questioned. Your right to remain is challenged. You get sick, and there's no hospital that will admit you. No doctor willing to treat you. No safety net except whatever your community can provide. You grow old, and there's no pension, no retirement, no guarantee that you won't end your days in poverty no matter how hard you worked. The precariousness was exhausting. You could do everything right, follow every rule, defer to every white person, pay every tax, and still watch everything collapse because the system wasn't designed for you to succeed. It was designed to make you fail, to prove that free black people couldn't thrive, to justify either re-enslavement or expulsion as the only solutions to the problem of your existence. And through all of this, you watched the enslaved people around you and knew that their fate and yours were bound together. The same ideology that justified their chains justified your restrictions. The same fear that kept them in bondage kept you in this peculiar half-freedom. When enslaved people resisted, when they ran away or rebelled, the restrictions on free black people tightened. Every Nat Turner produced a wave of new laws aimed at all black people, free or enslaved, as if liberty itself were contagious and needed to be quarantined. You understood that your freedom, such as it was existed only because it was useful to white people in some way, or because eliminating it would be more trouble than tolerating it. You were a pawn in a larger game, your status contingent on political calculations you couldn't influence, your future determined by debates in legislatures where you had no voice and no vote. Some free black people accumulated property anyway. Through skill, luck, and relentless work, they built businesses, bought land, even acquired wealth by the standards of their time. A few became genuinely prosperous, owning substantial property, employing workers, living in houses that rivaled those of middling white families. These success stories were remarkable precisely because they were so difficult, achieved against obstacles that would have crushed most people. But success brought its own dangers. A prosperous free black person attracted envy, resentment, accusations. White neighbors might claim that the property was acquired illegally, that the business competed unfairly, that something must be wrong because a black person couldn't possibly have earned what they had. Some successful free black people were driven out by mobs, their property destroyed, their years of work reduced to ashes. Others were cheated by white partners who knew that a black person couldn't testify against them in court. Still others simply disappeared, their fate unknown, their property absorbed by white neighbors who claimed it had been abandoned. The psychological weight of living this way was immense. You performed deference constantly, smiling when you wanted to scream, thanking people who insulted you, agreeing with opinions that denied your humanity. You learned to read white moods, to sense when danger was approaching, to make yourself small and unthreatening in situations where your size or confidence might be perceived as a challenge. You watched your words, knowing that the wrong comment to the wrong person could mean disaster. You watched your children, trying to teach them the survival skills they'd need, trying to prepare them for a world that hated them, without crushing the spirits that you wanted them to keep. The stress was constant. The vigilance was exhausting. The anger had nowhere to go except inward, where it curdled into something that had to be managed, controlled, hidden from the very people who caused it. And yet, free black people in the antebellum South didn't just survive. They built communities. They established churches and mutual aid societies. They created schools where they could, educated their children in secret where they couldn't. They maintained family connections across distances and legal barriers. They preserved traditions and created new ones. They found joy where joy could be found, in music and food and fellowship, in the small pleasures that couldn't be taxed or regulated away. They resisted in ways large and small, helping enslaved people escape, harboring runaways, passing information along networks that white people never fully understood. They held onto dignity in circumstances designed to strip it away. They insisted on their humanity in a society that denied it. That insistence, that stubborn refusal to accept the terms being offered, was itself a form of resistance, a daily rebellion against the ideology that said they shouldn't exist. The end came eventually. The Civil War erupted. The Confederacy rose and fell. Emancipation became law, and then constitutional amendment. Suddenly all black people were free, at least on paper, and the peculiar category of free black Southerners disappeared into a larger population facing different but related challenges. But the antebellum period left its marks. The restrictions, the humiliations, the constant danger, the survival strategies, all of it shaped communities and families for generations. The knowledge that freedom could be conditional, that rights could be taken as easily as given, that white tolerance was not the same as white acceptance. This knowledge passed down through families who had learned it the hard way. The vigilance didn't disappear when slavery ended. It couldn't. the dangers simply evolved into new forms. Jim Crow replacing the black codes, sundown towns replacing expulsion laws, police replacing slave patrols. The free black people of the antebellum South had learned to navigate a world that wanted them gone or subjugated, and that skill would be needed for a long time to come. Tonight, as you settle into sleep, think about what it meant to be free in a land of slavery. Think about carrying papers that proved your humanity to people who denied it anyway. Think about building a life on ground that could shift beneath you at any moment. Think about loving people whose freedom you couldn't guarantee, raising children into a future you couldn't control. Think about the courage it took to simply exist, to wake up every morning and face another day of the obstacles designed to break you. The free black people of the antebellum South didn't choose their circumstances. They chose how to respond to them. They chose survival and community and resistance. They chose to treat each other as fully human even when the law and society said otherwise. They chose hope when despair would have been easier. That choice, made daily, made hourly, made in the face of everything that told them to give up, is what we remember tonight. Their freedom was compromised, constrained, constantly threatened, but it was theirs. They held onto it with everything they had, and eventually they expanded it to include everyone. Rest now and let their perseverance carry you into peaceful sleep. Let's start with why you're here in the first place, because the path that led Black Americans into the trenches of France was twisted with contradictions that would be funny if they weren't so painful. The year is 1917, and America has finally entered the war that's been chewing up Europe for 3 years. President Wilson talks about making the world safe for democracy, and the words ring hollow in black communities where democracy has never applied. You can't vote in most of the South. You can't drink from the same water fountains as white people. You can be lynched for looking at a white woman wrong, or for no reason at all, and the killers will walk free. This is the democracy you're being asked to die for. And yet, when the call comes, black men answer. They answer because they hope that military service will prove their worth, will earn them the citizenship they've been denied, will force white America to finally see them as men. They answer because the alternative is staying home and being called cowards. They answer because W.E.B. Du Bois himself tells them to close ranks, to put aside their grievances and fight, to believe that victory abroad might bring victory at home. It's a gamble, and history will show it's a losing one, but they don't know that yet. The draft doesn't discriminate, at least not in who it calls. Black men register alongside white men, and when the numbers are drawn, black men are selected at disproportionate rates. The draft boards in the South are all white, and they have quotas to fill. And guess whose names end up on the lists? Nearly 400,000 black Americans will serve during the war, about 13% of the total American force, though black people are only 10% of the population. The math tells its own story, but getting drafted is just the beginning of the indignities. When you report for training, you discover that the army has no intention of treating you as an equal. Black soldiers are segregated into separate units, housed in separate facilities, trained by officers who often don't want them and don't believe they can fight. The camps in the South are particularly brutal. You're surrounded by white civilians who resent your presence, who see a black man in uniform as an offense against the natural order, who will assault you, or worse, if you forget your place for a moment. The training itself is a study in contradiction. You're supposed to be preparing for combat, but the army isn't sure it wants you in combat. Most black soldiers are assigned to labor battalions, the services of supply, where you'll dig ditches, load cargo, build roads, bury the dead, and perform all the backbreaking work that keeps an army functioning. The assumption is that black men are suited for physical labor, but not for fighting. That you lack the intelligence and courage for combat. That you'll break under fire and endanger white soldiers. These assumptions are based on nothing but racism, on the same lies that have been told about black people for centuries, but they shape policy nonetheless. The labor battalions work brutal hours under conditions that would be called abuse if the workers were white. You unload ships at French ports, handling tons of supplies every day, your body aching from labor that never seems to end. You build roads through muddy French countryside, laying gravel and corduroying logs, creating the infrastructure that lets the fighting army move. You dig graves for the fallen, white and black together in death, even if they couldn't serve together in life. The work is essential, and everyone knows it, but it carries none of the glory that combat brings. Only about 40,000 black soldiers will actually serve in combat roles, and even getting that far requires fighting a bureaucratic war before you ever see the enemy. Black leaders lobby, petition, and pressure the War Department to allow black men to prove themselves in battle. The NACP campaigns for black combat units and black officers to lead them. There's a training camp established at Fort Des Moines specifically to create black officers, a concession won after intense political struggle, producing about 1,200 commissioned officers who will lead black troops. These officers face impossible situations, expected to succeed with inadequate training, inadequate supplies, and white superior officers who often undermine them at every turn. The 92nd and 93rd Divisions are the two black combat divisions, and their experiences will differ dramatically based on who commands them and how they're used. The camps in the South are particularly brutal, though camps everywhere present challenges. Houston in 1917 shows what can happen when the tension breaks. Black soldiers of the 24th Infantry, subjected to constant harassment by white civilians and police, finally snap after a series of provocations. A soldier is beaten by police. A rumor spreads that he's been killed, and over 100 black soldiers march into Houston with rifles. The night ends with dead on both sides, and the aftermath is swift and terrible. 13 black soldiers are hanged after the largest murder trial in American history, conducted with minimal due process. The executions carried out before appeals can be filed. More are sentenced to life in prison. The message is clear. Black soldiers will be punished for responding to violence with violence, for failing to accept whatever treatment white America decides to give them. The Houston Mutiny haunts black soldiers throughout the war, a reminder of what happens when you forget your place, a burden of collective punishment that follows you even to France. Now imagine yourself shipped across the Atlantic, packed into a transport with thousands of other soldiers, the submarine threat constant, the destination uncertain. You've never been to Europe. Most Americans haven't. The ocean crossing takes about 2 weeks, and you spend it wondering what's waiting on the other side. The seasickness is brutal for some, the cramped quarters uncomfortable for everyone, the excitement and fear mixing into something that keeps you awake at night. When France finally appears on the horizon, you feel something you didn't expect, hope. Because France isn't America. France doesn't have Jim Crow. France has been fighting alongside African colonial troops for years and has developed, if not perfect equality, at least a functional tolerance that will seem like paradise compared to what you left behind. The French don't flinch when they see you. They don't cross the street to avoid you. They treat you like a soldier, like a man, like a human being. It's disorienting at first, this absence of constant degradation, and then it's intoxicating. But the American military follows you across the ocean, bringing its racism along like luggage. The infamous Secret Information Concerning Black American Troops memo, issued by the American military to French commanders, asks the French to treat black soldiers the way white Americans do. Don't shake their hands. Don't eat with them. Don't praise them too highly. Don't let French women interact with them socially. The memo is an attempt to export Jim Crow, to prevent black soldiers from experiencing equality that might make them uppity when they return home. Some French commanders ignore it. Others comply. The result is a patchwork of experiences, dignity in some places, and humiliation in others. The randomness of racism making each day uncertain. You never know when you'll be treated as a soldier, or when you'll be reminded that your country considers you less than human. Let's get you to the front, because that's where the real story happens. The trenches of the Western Front are unlike anything you've imagined, unlike anything anyone could imagine without seeing them. The war has been stalemated for years. Both sides dug into positions that stretch from Switzerland to the English Channel, neither able to advance more than a few miles before being thrown back. The technology of killing has outpaced the tactics of warfare, and the result is slaughter on an industrial scale. Machine guns mow down attacking infantry. Artillery shells tear bodies apart and bury them in the same motion. Poison gas drifts across no man's land, burning lungs and blinding eyes. The trenches themselves are attempts to survive this killing. Holes in the earth where men crouch below the level of machine gun fire, waiting for orders that might send them over the top into the meat grinder. You arrive at the front and descend into a trench for the first time. The smell hits you before anything else, a stench so thick you can taste it. Mud and blood and rotting flesh and human waste and the chemical tang of explosives, all blended into something that will live in your nostrils forever. The trench is narrower than you expected, barely wide enough for two men to pass, the walls reinforced with sandbags and wooden planks that are already rotting in the constant moisture. The floor is mud, not firm ground. Mud that sucks at your boots and never fully releases them. Mud that can swallow a man to his waist if he steps in the wrong place. Water seeps in from everywhere, pooling in the bottom of the trench, mixing with whatever else is down there. Your feet will be wet for weeks at a time, the skin softening and rotting, a condition called trench foot that can lead to gangrene and amputation if you're not careful. You learn to change your socks whenever possible, to rub whale oil into your feet, to do whatever you can to keep the rot at bay. The rats are everywhere. They're not shy like rats back home, scurrying away when humans appear. These rats are fat and bold, grown huge, on a diet you don't want to think about too carefully. They run across your body while you sleep, or try to sleep, their claws scratching through your uniform, their teeth gnawing at anything edible. Some men wake up with rats chewing on their hair, their ears, their fingers. Killing them is pointless because there are always more, an endless supply emerging from the churned earth where the bodies are buried, or not buried, just absorbed into the mud. The lice are almost worse because you can't escape them. They live in the seams of your uniform, in your hair, in every fold of skin, biting constantly, spreading disease, driving men to the edge of sanity with the endless itching. You learn to run a candle flame along the seams of your clothes, popping the lice with tiny sounds like distant gunfire. But they always come back. The daily routine of trench life is monotonous until it's terrifying. You rotate between frontline trenches, support trenches, and rest areas behind the lines, a few days in each before moving to the next. The rotation is supposed to give men a break from the worst of it, to prevent the complete psychological collapse that comes from too much time at the sharp end. But rest is relative. Even in the support trenches, shells can reach you. Even in the rest areas you work, repairing equipment, training, preparing for the next rotation forward. The frontline duty is the most dangerous, where you're closest to the enemy, where a sniper's bullet or a random shell can end you at any moment. You learn to keep your head down, literally, to never expose yourself above the parapet during daylight, to move through the trenches in a perpetual crouch that makes your back ache constantly. The trench system is more complex than you expected. Not just one ditch, but a whole network of them. The front line trench faces the enemy, with firing steps where you stand to shoot, and deeper sections where you shelter from bombardment. Behind that are communication trenches, zigzagging paths that connect the front to the rear, designed with sharp angles, so that if the enemy gets into one section, they can't fire straight down the length. Support trenches hold reserve troops ready to reinforce or counterattack. The whole system is like a maze, and getting lost is easy, especially at night, especially under fire. You learn the routes by heart because your life depends on knowing exactly where to go when everything goes wrong. At night, patrols go out into no man's land, that blasted landscape between the lines where nothing lives and death waits in shell craters. You crawl through mud and barbed wire, trying to gather intelligence about enemy positions, trying to capture prisoners for interrogation, trying to repair your own wire, trying to survive until you can crawl back. The darkness is both protection and danger, hiding you from enemy eyes, but also hiding the threats you're crawling toward. Some patrols don't come back. You hear them sometimes, wounded men calling for help in the darkness, calling until they stop calling, and you can't go to them because going to them means dying too. The sounds stay with you. Join the other sounds that replay in your mind when you try to sleep. Become part of the permanent background noise of trauma that every combat soldier carries. Stand to happens twice a day, at dawn and dusk, the times when attacks are most likely. Every man in the trench climbs to the firing step, rifle ready, eyes scanning the enemy line for any sign of movement. You stand there for an hour, sometimes longer, watching and waiting for an attack that usually doesn't come. The tension is exhausting, the constant readiness wearing you down, even when nothing happens. After stand-to comes breakfast if you're lucky, hot food brought up from the rear, tea and bacon and bread if the supply lines are working, cold bully beef and hardtack if they're not. You eat quickly, never knowing when the shelling might start, never able to fully relax even during meals. The artillery is the constant companion, the background noise of trench warfare that you learn to read like weather. The whistle of incoming shells, the pitch telling you whether to duck or run. The crash of explosions that shake the earth and shower you with dirt and debris. The silence afterward that's somehow worse because you're waiting for the next one. Barrages can last for hours, days even. The enemy trying to destroy your trenches before their infantry advances, trying to kill enough of you that the survivors can't resist. You huddle in dugouts carved into the trench walls, listening to the world being torn apart above you, praying that the next shell doesn't find the entrance, doesn't collapse the ceiling, doesn't bury you alive in French soil thousands of miles from home. Men break under the bombardment. They start screaming and can't stop. They run into the open, preferring quick death to the slow agony of waiting. Shell shock, they call it. And it's treated as cowardice by some officers, as if the mind can withstand infinite trauma without cracking. Now here's where your experience as a black soldier becomes different from what white soldiers face, where the particular burden of your skin meets the universal burden of combat. The 93rd Division, which includes the famous 369th Infantry Regiment, the Harlem Hellfighters, is assigned to fight under French command. This happens because American commanders don't want black soldiers in their ranks, don't trust them, don't believe they can fight, and are happy to hand them off to the French, who are desperate for reinforcements after 4 years of bleeding. It's a rejection, an insult, a statement that you're not good enough for the American army even though you wear its uniform. It turns out to be a blessing disguised as rejection. The French treat you as soldiers, plain and simple. They don't care about the theories of racial inferiority that American officers believe. They've been fighting alongside African colonial troops since the war began. Senegalese and Moroccan and Algerian soldiers who have proven themselves in combat countless times. They know that courage has no color. They give you French weapons because there aren't enough American weapons, and because French ammunition is what the supply lines deliver. You trade your American Enfield rifle for a French Liebel, your campaign hat for a blue Adrian helmet. You learn French military terminology, French tactics, French ways of doing things. You eat French rations, drink French wine, learn French curses to shout when the shells come down. The integration isn't perfect. The French have their own racial attitudes, their own colonial hierarchies, their own assumptions about the African troops in their ranks. But it's so much better than what you left behind that it feels like liberation. French officers address you with respect. French civilians welcome you into their homes, their cafes, their lives. You discover what it feels like to walk down a street without calculating threat, to enter an establishment without wondering if you'll be served, to exist in public without the constant low-grade terror that American life requires. Some soldiers fall in love with French women, relationships that would be illegal in many American states, and the women don't seem to care about the laws of a country they've never seen. The Harlem Hellfighters earn their nickname the hard way. They spend 191 days in combat, longer than any other American unit in the war, and they will never lose a foot of ground to the enemy, never have a man captured despite intense fighting. They hold positions when ordered to hold, attack when ordered to attack, endure bombardments and gas attacks and raids with a determination that silences anyone who questioned their courage. The entire regiment will be awarded the Croix de Guerre, France's highest military honor, a recognition that the American military never provides. Individual soldiers collect medals for specific acts of bravery, their heroism documented and celebrated by a nation that isn't theirs. Henry Johnson and Needham Roberts become the first Americans of any color to receive the Croix de Guerre individually, and their story shows what black soldiers were capable of when given the chance. They're on sentry duty in May 1918 when a German raiding party hits their position. There are at least 24 Germans, maybe more, against 2 men. Roberts is wounded early, unable to stand, but he hands grenades to Johnson, who throws them into the attackers. When the rifle jams, Johnson uses it as a club. When that breaks, he pulls his bolo knife and wades into the Germans, slashing and stabbing, taking wounds but keeping fighting. The Germans are trying to drag Roberts away as a prisoner, and Johnson isn't going to let that happen. He kills at least 4 Germans and wounds many more, fighting until the raiders retreat, fighting until reinforcements arrive to find him standing over Roberts, covered in blood, most of it not his own. Johnson becomes a hero in France, his face on postcards, his story told in newspapers, a symbol of American valor at a time when America needs symbols. When he returns home, he'll be forgotten, denied the Medal of Honor he deserves, denied disability benefits despite injuries that leave him unable to work, and will die in poverty in 1929. The army won't acknowledge his heroism with the Medal of Honor until 2015, almost a century too late. The 92nd Division has a harder time. Kept under American command, they're saddled with white officers, many from the South, who don't believe black soldiers can fight and treat them accordingly. The division is poorly trained, poorly supplied, poorly led. When they're finally committed to combat in the Meuse-Argonne offensive, the largest American operation of the war, some units perform well while others struggle. The failures are blamed on black cowardice and incompetence rather than on the systemic neglect that caused them. Reports are written that condemn black soldiers as unreliable, that use the 92nd's difficulties to argue against ever using black combat troops again. The reports ignore the units that fought bravely, ignore the officers who failed their men, ignore everything that doesn't fit the predetermined conclusion. These reports will shape military policy for decades, will be cited to justify continued segregation, will erase the sacrifices of men who deserved better. Let's talk about what you're actually fighting for, beyond the grand rhetoric about democracy. You're fighting for the man next to you, same as soldiers in every war. The bonds formed in trenches transcend race in ways that would be impossible back home, at least within your own unit. You share food, share cigarettes, share body heat on cold nights, share the trauma of watching friends die. The soldier who pulls you into a shell crater when the shelling starts doesn't care about your color. The soldier you drag back to the trench after he's wounded doesn't care either. Combat creates intimacy that peacetime never allows, a closeness born of mutual dependence that makes the racism waiting back home seem even more absurd. You're good enough to die next to, but not good enough to drink next to. You're trusted with a rifle in France, but will be lynched for asserting yourself in Georgia. The contradiction burns, and you carry that burning with you into every assault, every patrol, every moment of terror and courage. The gas attacks are particular nightmares. Poison gas was supposed to break the stalemate, a weapon so horrible it would force the enemy to surrender or die. Instead, both sides use it, and it becomes another feature of the landscape, another way to die or wish you had. When the alarm goes up, you have seconds to get your mask on, to seal it against your face, to trust that the rubber and charcoal will filter out whatever the Germans have sent this time. Chlorine burns the lungs, fills them with fluid until you drown in your own body. Phosgene is worse, delayed effects that seem mild at first and then kill you a day later. Mustard gas blisters the skin, blinds the eyes, destroys the lungs over agonizing weeks. You've seen men who breathe too much, their skin peeling, their eyes swollen shut, their lungs rattling with every breath. You've helped carry them to aid stations knowing they won't survive. The masks are hot and claustrophobic, the lenses fogging with your breath, the filter making each inhale a labor. You fight in masks sometimes, unable to see clearly, unable to hear commands, stumbling through toxic fog toward an enemy you can barely perceive. Going over the top is the moment everything else leads to. The whistle blows, and you climb out of the relative safety of the trench into the open killing ground. Your legs are heavy, your heart pounding, your mind screaming at you to get back down. But you go forward because everyone is going forward. Because stopping means letting down the men beside you. Because death is waiting either way. And at least this death moves towards something. The machine guns open up almost immediately. That stuttering roar that means men are falling. That the mathematics of modern warfare are being calculated in blood. You run, or try to run, through mud that grabs at your feet, through craters that swallow you to the waist, through barbed wire that tears at your uniform and your flesh. Men drop around you, some silently, some screaming, some just sitting down as if tired, and then not getting up. You don't stop to help because stopping means dying, because the only way out is through, because the aid station is behind you and the objective is ahead. The moments after a successful assault are strange and quiet. You've taken the enemy trench, or what's left of it, and now you're standing in their filth instead of yours. German bodies lie where they fell, some still moving, some already still. The smell is different here, the same bass notes of death and decay, but with unfamiliar tobacco and unfamiliar food mixed in. Prisoners emerge with hands raised, terrified boys who look just like the terrified boys in your unit, their Feldgrau uniforms muddy and torn, their eyes asking if you're going to kill them. You don't, usually. The rules say prisoners are valuable, that they know things the intelligence officers want to know. You send them back toward your lines, and then you start fortifying, because the Germans will counterattack, and you need to be ready. You pile sandbags, string wire, set up machine guns facing the other way. The trench you just captured becomes your trench, and you'll defend it with the same desperation you just used to take it. War is a machine that consumes space and lives without producing anything but more war. The wounded are everywhere after an assault, moaning in shell holes, dragging themselves toward aid stations, lying still where they fell. The stretcher bearers work through the chaos. Brave men who go into fire without weapons to bring back those who might be saved. Being a stretcher bearer is one of the most dangerous jobs in the war, and black soldiers serve as stretcher bearers throughout the conflict, carrying white and black wounded alike, because in the aid stations, at least, blood is blood. The aid stations themselves are overwhelmed during major operations, surgeons working for days without rest, amputating limbs and probing for shrapnel by the light of oil lamps. The wounds are horrific, the weapons of modern war designed to tear and shatter, to create injuries that earlier medicine couldn't have addressed. Men survive things that would have killed them in any previous war, saved by antiseptics and blood transfusions and surgical techniques developed specifically for this slaughter. If you're wounded badly enough, you're evacuated to hospitals further back, moving through a chain of medical facilities until you reach somewhere safe enough for recovery. The hospitals are segregated, of course, black soldiers treated in separate wards by separate staff, the Jim Crow following you even when you're bleeding. But the French hospitals don't segregate, and some black soldiers find themselves receiving care alongside white patients, a novelty that feels normal after the abnormality of American arrangements. Recovery can take weeks or months, and then you're either sent back to your unit, or, if the wounds are too severe, discharged and sent home. The men sent home often struggle, their injuries making work difficult, the military benefits they're entitled to denied or delayed, the gratitude of a nation conspicuously absent. The winter in the trenches is a special kind of suffering. The mud freezes and then thaws, cycling between hard and soft, in ways that make everything worse. Your uniform is never dry, never warm, never adequate against the cold that seeps into everything. Your fingers go numb, making it hard to work your rifle, hard to button your coat, hard to do anything that requires fine motor control. Frostbite claims toes and fingers, ears and noses, the flesh dying in the cold and turning black. You stamp your feet constantly, trying to keep the blood flowing, trying to convince yourself that the tingling hasn't turned to numbness. At night, you huddle with others for warmth. Body heat, the only reliable source. Personal space, a luxury you can't afford. The hot food that's supposed to come up from the rear arrives cold, more often than not. the carrying parties unable to move fast enough, the food losing heat with every step. You eat it anyway because cold food is better than no food, because your body needs fuel to generate warmth, because refusing to eat is refusing to survive. The letters from home are lifelines and reminders. Your family writes about normal things, about crops and weather and neighborhood gossip, about a world that seems impossibly distant from where you are. They don't know what the trenches are really like because you don't tell them, because putting it into words seems impossible, because you don't want to worry them any more than they already do. Sometimes letters bring news you don't want. A lynching back home, a relative arrested for some invented offense, the reminder that the country you're fighting for is still at war with your people. The contrast is maddening. Here in France, you're treated with something approaching respect. At home, your family can't ride in the front of a streetcar. Here, you're trusted with weapons and responsibility. At home, voting is a risk that can get you killed. You fight harder because of it, or maybe despite it, channeling the anger into something useful, proving with every battle that black men can soldier as well as anyone. The war ends in November 1918, an armistice that stops the killing with sudden abruptness. One moment the guns are firing, the next moment silence falls along the entire Western Front, a silence so profound it seems supernatural after years of constant noise. You stand in your trench, rifle still in hand, waiting for something that doesn't come. Men emerge cautiously, not quite believing it's over, half expecting the shooting to start again. When it doesn't, when the minutes stretch into hours and the hours into days, something releases in your chest that you didn't know was clenched. You survived. Somehow, against all the odds and all the ways there were to die, you survived. The celebrations are muted at first, exhaustion dampening everything, and then they build into something like joy. You drink whatever's available, sing songs in languages you've learned from your French comrades, embrace men who were strangers a year ago and are now closer than brothers. The return home brings its own battles, a different kind of warfare that you're even less prepared for than the trenches. You march through French streets, and French crowds cheer, throw flowers, call you heroes. The women who were supposed to avoid you, according to that memo, instead kiss your cheeks and shake your hands, tell you mercy with tears in their eyes. You're honored with medals and parades, your sacrifices acknowledged by a nation that isn't yours, but that has treated you better than the nation that is. The French don't want you to leave. Some soldiers don't, staying behind to build lives in a country where they can breathe, where they can walk into any restaurant and be served, where they can love who they love without fear of the rope. But most of you board the ships home, carrying souvenirs and memories and wounds both visible and invisible. With every mile westward, you feel the walls closing in again. The ships themselves are segregated, black soldiers in separate quarters, eating at separate times, reminded before you even reach American waters that the equality you tasted in France was borrowed, temporary, not meant for you to keep. The debarkation camps are segregated, black units processed separately, the efficiency of military logistics maintaining the inefficiency of racism. The trains home are segregated, and if you're heading south, you learn to move to the Jim Crow car before you cross the Mason-Dixon line, to shed the dignity you earned in France before it gets you killed in Georgia. Some men refuse, and some of those men don't make it home alive, murdered for the crime of believing that service to their country entitled them to respect. The parades, where they happen at all, are segregated, black soldiers marching separately or not marching at all. White America doesn't want to see black men in uniform. doesn't want to acknowledge that black men fought and died and proved themselves. The sight is too dangerous, too likely to give other black people ideas, too likely to undermine the whole structure of white supremacy that depends on black inferiority. The Harlem Hellfighters get their parade up Fifth Avenue, a proud march through the neighborhood that sent them off. Thousands of people lining the streets to welcome them home. The regimental band plays, the same band that introduced jazz to France and will help define American music for the century to come. It's a glorious day, a moment of recognition and pride, but it's an exception. Most black veterans come home quietly, told to forget what they experienced in France, warned not to expect anything to change, advised to resume their place at the bottom of American society, as if the war never happened. The Red Summer of 1919 makes the warning explicit and bloody. Across America, in more than 24 cities and towns, white mobs attack black communities with a ferocity that exceeds anything since Reconstruction. The violence targets veterans specifically, punishing them for wearing uniforms, for having ideas above their station, for thinking that fighting for democracy meant they deserved some. In Chicago, a black teenager swimming in Lake Michigan drifts across an invisible line into white water and is stoned until he drowns. The police do nothing, and when black people protest, the city explodes into days of rioting that leave dozens dead and hundreds homeless. In Washington, white sailors and soldiers, many just back from France themselves, roam through black neighborhoods attacking anyone they find, until black veterans organize and fight back, turning the nation's capital into a battleground. In Elaine, Arkansas, black sharecroppers who try to organize for better treatment are massacred. Hundreds killed according to some estimates. The true number never known because no one bothered to count black bodies. In cities and towns across the country, the pattern repeats: white violence, black resistance, official indifference or active support for the attackers. Some veterans fight back using skills learned in France, organizing community defense, refusing to be victims. The fighting terrifies white America, which expected submission and got resistance, which thought the war would teach black men their place and found instead that it taught them their worth. The backlash is severe. More lynchings, more restrictions, more determined efforts to push black Americans back into the subordination they had briefly escaped. But something had changed that couldn't be unchanged. The men who served in France had seen another possibility, had lived in a world where their skin didn't automatically mark them as inferior, had proven to themselves and to anyone watching that they could do anything white soldiers could do. That knowledge couldn't be unlearned. It fueled the new Negro movement, the cultural explosion of the Harlem Renaissance, the early stirrings of the civil rights movement that would eventually transform America. The veterans returned to their communities with new confidence, new expectations, new determination to claim what they had earned. The country wasn't ready to give it to them. Not yet, but the struggle had begun, and it would continue until it couldn't be ignored any longer. Tonight, as you settle into sleep, think about what those men endured. The trenches that were misery for everyone, the extra burden they carried because of who they were. Think about Henry Johnson fighting off a German raid with a knife and his fists, saving his friend, becoming a hero who would die forgotten. Think about the Harlem Hellfighters spending 191 days under fire, never retreating, never surrendering. Think about the men who went over the top knowing they might not come back, fighting for a country that wouldn't fight for them, believing that courage might eventually earn them justice. The trenches of France were hell, but they were also proving grounds, places where black soldiers demonstrated beyond any doubt that they belonged, that they were capable, that the lies told about them were lies. That proof didn't change America overnight, but it planted seeds that would eventually flower, would inspire generations who came after, would contribute to a long, slow movement toward the equality that those soldiers deserved and never received. Let their sacrifice carry you into peaceful sleep, and remember that the fight they started continues still.